Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
The rain is coming down so hard I am idling along. I can barely see the nightshade hood ornament on my 10-year-old Ravenco X100 Crew C pickup. I'm trying to get home to my family, my loving wife, Angela, and my children, Alex and Lily. I'm David, by the way, David Waters. I'm 42, and I'm on my way home early since the storm I'm fighting has canceled flights all over the area. I was due to fly up to Chicago from Springfield on business, but first, the Chicago airfields at Drake and ONC were closed due to the storm. The storm was moving so fast that they thought it would clear up in a few hours, so our flight was still scheduled. We would be flying to Albuquerque and then to Omaha before heading back to Chicago. That was the plan, but like all plans, once engaging the enemy, the plans became just something on paper or in your head. The enemy, of course, was this freak storm that developed out of nowhere in the mountains near Laguna, Colorado, and headed east. My flight was scheduled for 3:15 p.m., and I had driven my old truck to the airport so Angela wouldn't have to leave work early. She worked at an accounting firm in South Springfield. She had some special projects she was working on, and I figured no one would bother with an old truck like mine in the parking lot. My truck had seen a lot of wear and tear over the 10 years I have owned it. I bought it new, and for the first few years it was always neat, clean, and shiny. Then I helped a coworker move, and the bed got a little banged up and scratched. I realized then that it was a work truck, not a showpiece. So now it had some dents, a couple of places with primer covering areas where some jerk had banged into it, which I had fixed but not yet painted over. But the truck ran like a top. The engine purred like a kitten at idle but roared like a lion when I really gave it some gas. The plan changed, and we were supposed to fly to St. Louis and then back to Chicago, but that was canceled when the storm intensified. It was drawing air and moisture from the Gulf and wind from the northwest, and it just kept growing. By 7:15 p.m., all flights were canceled out of the Hartman Regional Airport. I headed home while it was still relatively calm in South Springfield. I headed north up the 117 toll road towards Springdale, and I was doing okay, but the rain got harder the farther north I went. It was still okay to drive in, but when I reached the State Route 215 exit, the rain turned heavier. By the next exit, I was the only one on the road. By the time I got to the Timber Ridge School exit going east into Springdale, I knew I was the only one on the road. I saw no cars and no headlights coming toward me either, but then again I could only see about 200 feet in any direction. The rain started coming down in sheets, driven by the northwest wind, making it harder and harder to see anything. I noticed lightning in the distance as I came up 117, but now it was flashing all around me, nearly blinding me. The truck shook with the thunder. I had put my sunglasses on halfway up 117 to reduce the glare of the headlights and overhead lights at the exits reflecting off the road surface. It helped a great deal, but now, with the lightning strikes, I was still blinded for seconds after each flash. By now, I was barely crawling along at an idle. I got off State Route 10 and onto Jackson Lane, headed for my home on Maple Crest Drive off of Redstone Avenue. I was less than 2 miles from home and safety. It was close to 9:30 p.m. according to my dashboard clock. I had just turned onto Forest Trail when lightning struck a neighbor's tree, causing it to fall across the road, taking out his car parked in the street. There was no way to get around it, so I turned back and retraced my route. I could either go back and take Highland Ridge Boulevard or all the way back to Maple Crest Drive to get to the other side and home. The tree that fell was about 2 houses from the corner of Highland Ridge and Summit. I drove up Highland Ridge and rounded the corner, hoping for home at last. While trying to pull into my driveway, I saw the reflection of a car's taillights in my headlights. There was a car parked in my driveway where I usually parked my truck. Angela's car would be in the garage, and I typically parked to the side of the drive where she could get her car out. But this car wasn't hers. It was one I didn't recognize. I wondered who could have come here knowing I was supposed to be gone for 3 days. Well, I was about to find out. I hit the garage door opener, parked in the driveway behind Angela's car, and hurried into the garage, getting soaked in the process. I jotted down the license plate of the unknown car on a scrap piece of lumber, then closed the garage door just as thunder boomed loudly. I shook myself off and tried to dry off with some shop rags before tracking water into the house. Angela would go ballistic if I soaked the carpet. I stripped down, grabbed a pair of shorts from the laundry room, and dried off with a towel. Then I opened the kitchen door. I was semi-dry and now shivering from the cold. Who would have thought that just 5 hours ago it was 100 degrees outside, and now the thermometer in the garage was reading closer to 40 degrees. I couldn't hear much as I walked into what seemed like an empty house. The timer light for the living room had come on, so at least we hadn't lost power yet. However, it seemed like I could hear voices. The voices weren't coming from the dining room, living room, or even our bedroom. It sounded like they were coming from Alex's room or somewhere down the hallway. But why from there? I walked into the house, shivering from the cold, and maybe a little from fear. I walked down the hallway and noticed Alex's door was closed, with light seeping out from underneath. I checked Lily's room. The door was open, and no one was there. What the hell is going on? I crept up to Alex's door and listened. I could distinctly hear flesh slapping against flesh. My stomach turned. If Lily was gone, Alex would be too. Angela must have arranged for them to stay at my parents' place while I was away. That left only Angela and whoever owned the strange car in the driveway. My jaw clenched. This wasn't just a home invasion. This was an invasion of my life. I turned around and headed to our bedroom. Well, our bedroom probably wasn't the right term anymore, was it? I reached under the nightstand drawer and retrieved my .45 Colt Defender. I had custom-mounted a holster to the underside of the shelf for easy access. I checked the magazine, chambered around, and crept back across the living room to the hallway. Even through the sound of rain pounding on the roof, I could still hear them. I checked the doorknob of Alex's room. It wasn't locked. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened the door just a crack. There, on Alex's bed, lay Angela, my wife, underneath some guy who was on top of her and moving rhythmically, clearly enjoying himself. Angela's arms were pinned above her head with one of his hands as he pounded away. The bed, pushed against the back wall of the room, gave me a clear view of their profile. The man was about our age, mid-40s, and in decent shape from what I could see. He wasn't as big as me, but that didn't matter now. Enough was enough. I opened the door fully and pointed the gun at the guy's torso. In the calmest voice I could muster, I said, "Please stop what you're doing to my wife before I blow a hole big enough in your chest to drive my truck through." Angela's eyes widened in shock. Then she turned her head away and slurred, "Get off me before he shoots us both." "Well, isn't this a lovely picture?" I said, my voice thick with anger and disbelief. "I go away on business, and my wife brings some jackass into my house and screws him on my son's bed. Angela, were you too tired of screwing him on our bed? Or are you just playing musical beds now? Was Lily's bed next? Or the dining room table? Or maybe the couch in the living room? Tell me, Angela, what do you have to say for yourself?" The guy stammered something, but I cut him off by pulling the trigger and firing a shot into the wall above his head. The deafening sound filled the room, and both of them screamed. He fainted, and Angela nearly did the same. They hadn't even untangled themselves before I pulled him off her and dumped him onto the floor. Looking at the small hole in the wall behind Alex's bed, I figured it would take some work to fix, but that was a problem for later. Right now, my focus was on dealing with this betrayal. I dragged a chair over from Alex's desk, sat down, and tapped the guy's cheek with the barrel of my gun. "Wakey, wakey," I said coldly. "Time to face the music." His eyes fluttered open, and I pointed the gun directly at his chest. "What's your name, jackass?" I asked. Paul Richards," he stuttered, his voice trembling. "Look, I really shouldn't be here. I should be at home with my wife and kids. Please, don't kill me. I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." "Well, Paul, how do you know my wife?" I asked, my voice low and menacing. She works for me," he admitted, shaking. "At Harper & Associates. I've been trying for months to get Angela to go out with me. She's beautiful, and she's always so put together at work. I don't know what came over me." "Paul, you're going to tell me everything," I said, my finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "And if you lie, I'll know. So start talking. How did you end up in my house, screwing my wife?" He gulped audibly and began to spill the story, explaining how he had been pursuing Angela at work for months, complimenting her, offering her help, and eventually persuading her to let him come home with her tonight. When he finished, I stood up and told him, "Get dressed and meet me in the dining room. We're going to have a long conversation about your future or lack thereof. And don't even think about running, because if you do, I'll hunt you down. Do we understand each other?" Paul nodded rapidly. Pulling on his clothes as I left the room, I walked into the kids' bathroom, where Angela had retreated. She was sitting on the edge of the tub, wrapped in a towel, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Her hands trembled as she looked up at me, unsure of what to say. "Angela," I said coldly, "you're going to stay in Alex's room for now. Get dressed, and don't come out until I call you. You need to decide if you're staying in this house or leaving with Paul. Understand?" She nodded weakly and hurried to gather her clothes. I left her there and headed to the dining room, where Paul was now sitting awkwardly at the table, fidgeting nervously. I grabbed a set of zip ties from the garage and quickly secured Paul to the chair. "This is for your safety as much as mine," I said flatly. "Now we're going to talk. And I'd suggest you be very honest because your life depends on it." Paul's face turned pale and he nodded. "I'll tell you everything," he said quickly. "Good," I said. "Start at the beginning. I want every detail, how long this has been going on, what you've done, what you gave her to make her go along with it. Don't leave anything out." Paul hesitated for a moment before finally spilling the truth. He admitted that he had been attracted to Angela from the moment she started working for him, and he had been trying to get close to her for months. At first, it was just compliments and casual conversations. Then, at the Christmas party, he had cornered her under the mistletoe and kissed her, which she angrily rebuffed. But he didn't stop there. Over time, he started calling her into his office for minor work-related discussions, using the opportunity to get closer to her. About 2 weeks ago, he noticed she was upset after we had an argument about something trivial. He used that moment to comfort her, gradually wearing down her defenses. Finally, tonight, he offered to drive her home after work. He admitted to slipping her something, just a mild relaxant, as he put it, to make her more pliable. At that point, my grip tightened on the gun, and Paul immediately backpedaled. "I'm sorry," he exclaimed. "I swear I'll never go near her again. Please, don't kill me." I stared at him, my anger boiling over. "You drugged my wife and violated her trust, and mine. That's not something I take lightly, Paul." I stood up, walked to the garage, and grabbed my toolbox. Returning to the dining room, I leaned down to his level and said, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Angela, then to me. After that, you're going to tell the police exactly what you did tonight. And if you try to lie or twist the story, I'll make sure you regret it. Are we clear?" Paul nodded, his face ashen. "Yes. Yes, I understand." Angela emerged from Alex's room a short while later, dressed but looking disheveled and defeated. She avoided my gaze as she walked into the dining room. Paul sat there, still tied to the chair, his head hung low. "Paul," I said, motioning toward her, "apologize to my wife. Now." Paul looked up at Angela, his eyes filled with fear. "Angela," he stammered, "I am so sorry. I never should have done this. I never should have pursued you or drugged you. I crossed every line, and I'll regret this for the rest of my life. Please believe me when I say I'm sorry." Angela didn't respond. She just stared at him, her face a mixture of anger and sadness. "And now," I said, leaning closer to Paul, "apologize to me." Paul's head snapped toward me. "David, I'm sorry. I truly am. I disrespected you, your marriage, and your family. I'll never come near Angela or your home again. I'll cooperate with the police. Just, please don't hurt me." I let the silence linger, making sure he felt the weight of my fury before I spoke again. "Good. Now we're going to take this to the next step." I walked into the kitchen, grabbed my phone, and called the police. "This is David Waters," I said when the dispatcher answered. "I need officers at my home immediately. I have a man restrained who admitted to drugging and sexually assaulting my wife." The dispatcher assured me that officers were en route. I returned to the dining room and stood between Paul and Angela, the tension in the room so thick it was suffocating. "Angela," I said, turning to her, "I need to know everything. From the moment this started to the moment I walked in tonight. Don't leave anything out." Angela hesitated, her lip trembling. "It started months ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Paul would compliment me at work, make small talk, and try to spend time alone with me. I always brushed it off, but then we had that fight about the swimsuit I bought and I was upset. I let him comfort me at work, but I never thought it would go beyond that. Tonight, I don't even know how it got this far. He offered me a drink at work, and the next thing I remember, he was following me into the house. I don't remember much else after that. I swear, David, I didn't want this." Her voice broke, and she began to cry. I placed a hand on her shoulder, not out of forgiveness but to let her know I'd heard her. We sat in tense silence until the sound of sirens broke through the night. I opened the door to two officers and explained the situation. They moved quickly, taking Paul into custody and ensuring Angela received medical attention. I handed over the zip ties and the drink Paul had given her at work as evidence, explaining everything that had transpired. The officers took detailed statements from both Angela and me, while Paul sat silently in the back of the squad car parked in our driveway. One officer retrieved the bottle Paul had used to drug Angela from my kitchen counter, carefully bagging it as evidence. They assured us that it would be sent for testing. As they led Paul away, I stepped outside to watch, arms crossed. One of the officers, a sergeant, turned to me. "Mr. Waters will keep you updated. Based on what you've told us and the evidence we've collected, this is looking like a solid case. But I'd recommend you and your wife get a lawyer, just to cover all bases." "Thank you, Sergeant," I replied curtly. "We'll do that." Inside the house, Angela sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her tear-streaked face full of remorse. "David, not now," I said, cutting her off. "We'll talk later. Right now, I need to think." I went to the garage to clear my head, the events of the night replaying in my mind. The sight of Angela with Paul, the gunshot, the tension. It all weighed heavily on me. I grabbed a toolbox and headed to Alex's room to inspect the bullet hole in the wall. The damage was worse than I thought. The bullet had not only pierced the drywall, but had also blown through the insulation and left a sizable dent in the siding outside. I made a temporary patch with some spare materials from the garage, knowing I'd have to do a proper repair before Alex and Lily returned. After documenting the damage with photos, I returned to the living room. Angela was still sitting there, her eyes red and swollen. She didn't speak, waiting for me to say something. I stood in front of her, arms crossed, and finally broke the silence. "I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen," I began. "You made choices, Angela. Maybe you didn't choose what happened tonight, but you let it get to this point. I need to know if this marriage can even survive what you've done." Angela sobbed openly, her words coming out in broken gasps. "David, I know I've destroyed your trust. I don't know how I let it get this far. I never wanted this, never. I love you, and I'm so sorry." Her words stung, but they also showed the depth of her regret. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I turned and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. I needed time to process everything. Angela remained seated in the living room, her sobs quieter now, but the tension in the house was palpable. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring into my glass of water. I had so many questions swirling in my mind, but I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answers yet. After several long minutes, I walked back into the living room and sat down across from her. "Angela," I said evenly, "we can't move forward until we deal with this, and I need complete honesty from you. Start from the beginning, everything, and don't leave anything out." She took a deep, shuddering breath and began to speak. "Started at the Christmas party," she said, her voice trembling. "Paul kissed me under the mistletoe. I pushed him away and told him it was inappropriate, but he brushed it off like it was no big deal. After that, he started calling me into his office more often, making comments, finding excuses to touch my arm or shoulder. I tried to keep it professional, but he wouldn't stop." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I didn't tell you because I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to cause trouble at work. But he kept pushing, and then, after our argument about the swimsuit, he must have sensed I was vulnerable. He comforted me at work, told me I deserved better, and I guess I started believing him." My jaw clenched, but I stayed silent, letting her continue. "Tonight, he offered me a drink at work before we left. I thought it was just a soda, but after I drank it, everything became hazy. I don't even remember how we got here. I remember flashes, him leading me into the house, into Alex's room, but everything else is a blur. I swear, David, I never wanted this. I didn't know he'd drugged me until you showed up." Her tears returned in full force, and she buried her face in her hands. I sat back, digesting her words. If what she said was true, she had been manipulated and drugged, but she had also allowed things to escalate to a point of no return. "Angela," I said finally, my voice calm but firm, "you should have told me about Paul from the start. Hiding it gave him the opportunity to exploit you, and now we're here." She nodded, her face still buried in her hands. "I know," she whispered. "I know I failed you. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, David. I'll go to counseling, quit my job, anything. Just please don't give up on me." I sighed heavily, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "We'll see," I said. "Right now, we need to get through the next steps. The police will want more statements, and this isn't going away anytime soon. But if there's one thing I need from you, it's complete transparency. No more secrets. If you want a chance to fix this, that's non-negotiable." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with remorse and hope. "Promise," she said. "No more secrets." The rest of the night passed in heavy silence. Angela retreated to the guest room after I told her I needed space. I stayed in the living room, staring at the darkened TV screen, replaying everything over and over in my head. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Angela with Paul, heard the slap of flesh, and felt the cold weight of betrayal all over again. By the time the sun rose, I knew I couldn't sit and stew in my thoughts forever. There was too much to do. I brewed a pot of coffee and made a mental list of everything that needed addressing: the police statements, the damage to the house, the kids' return, and figuring out what came next for my marriage. Angela emerged from the guest room, her face pale and eyes bloodshot. She hesitated in the doorway of the living room, holding a mug of coffee. "Good morning," she said softly. I nodded but didn't say anything. The silence between us stretched painfully. Finally, I spoke. "We need to go to the sheriff's office today. The officers will want formal statements from both of us." "Okay," she said quietly. "Should I call the kids? Let them know we'll pick them up later?" "I'll handle it," I said. "Right now, we need to focus on this." After a quick breakfast, we drove to the sheriff's office. The atmosphere in the car was tense and heavy, but neither of us tried to break it. When we arrived, we were directed to separate rooms to give our statements. Angela went first, escorted by a female deputy. I sat in the waiting area, the minutes dragging like hours. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, hurt, confusion, but I forced myself to stay composed. Whatever happened next, I needed to keep a level head for my own sake and for the kids. When Angela returned, she looked exhausted. "They're ready for you," she said, her voice barely audible. I walked into the interrogation room and sat across from a detective and a sergeant. "Mr. Waters, thank you for coming in," the detective said. "We're just going to ask you a few questions to clarify some details." I recounted everything from the moment I got home to the moment the officers arrived. I told them about the gunshot, the confrontation, and Paul's confession. I also explained Angela's account of being drugged, emphasizing that she was not a willing participant in what had happened. The sergeant nodded as he took notes. "Thank you, Mr. Waters. Your cooperation is appreciated. Based on the evidence we've collected so far, including the drink Paul gave your wife, we're confident we can build a strong case against him. For now, we'll be in touch if we need anything further." As I left the room, I felt a small sense of relief. At least the legal side of this was being handled. But the emotional fallout was something no police report or legal proceeding could fix. Angela was waiting for me in the car, sitting silently with her hands folded tightly in her lap. I climbed into the driver's seat, closed the door, and stared out through the windshield for a moment before speaking. "They've got enough evidence to charge him," I said, my voice flat. "They'll contact us if they need more." Angela nodded, still avoiding my eyes. "That's good," she said softly, though her tone lacked any real relief. The drive home was quiet, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavily between us. Once we got back, I parked the car in the driveway and turned to Angela. "The kids are coming home tonight," I said. "They don't need to know about this. Not now, not ever. We need to present a united front, at least for them." Angela nodded again, tears forming in her eyes. "I'll do whatever you think is best," she said. I stepped out of the car and walked into the house without another word. There were still practical matters to address: repairs to the house, making sure the kids' rooms looked normal, and preparing for their return. I headed straight to Alex's room, where the patched bullet hole still stared at me like a reminder of the chaos from the night before. I grabbed a can of paint and touched up the wall until the patch was nearly invisible. Angela appeared in the doorway as I finished. "Can I help?" she asked hesitantly. "No," I replied curtly. "I've got it." She lingered for a moment before retreating. I could feel her guilt and shame radiating from her, but I wasn't ready to face it, or her, just yet. As the afternoon wore on, I focused on practical tasks to keep my mind occupied. I called my parents to arrange for the kids' pickup, explaining that the storm had delayed us. They didn't press for details, thankfully, and I promised to bring Alex and Lily home as soon as possible. When the kids arrived that evening, Angela and I greeted them together at the door. They were full of stories about their time with their grandparents and didn't seem to notice the tension between us. For their sake, I pushed aside my anger and tried to act normal. Angela did the same, though I could see the strain in her forced smiles and overly cheerful tone. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, Angela approached me in the living room. "David," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I've hurt you. I know it's going to take time to fix this, but I love you. I want to fight for us, for our family. Please tell me you're willing to try." I stared at her for a long moment, my emotions a storm inside me. Finally, I spoke. "Angela, I don't know. What you've done, what happened, it's not something I can just forgive overnight. It's going to take time, and I need to see that you're willing to put in the work, not just with me, but with yourself. Because if this happens again, I'm done." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered. "I'll go to counseling, quit my job, whatever you need. Just please don't give up on me." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Instead, I stood up and walked to the bedroom, leaving her standing alone in the living room. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Angela hadn't joined me, choosing instead to sleep in the guest room. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. My mind was anything but quiet, though. The images, the sounds, the betrayal, they all replayed over and over. By morning, I had come to a tentative decision. If there was any chance of salvaging our marriage, it would require more than apologies and promises. It would require accountability, transparency, and effort on both our parts. I got up and went to the guest room. Angela was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking like she hadn't slept a wink. She glanced up at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "We're going to counseling," I said firmly. "Both of us. Together and separately. If we're going to move forward, we need help." Angela nodded quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll do it," she said. "Anything you need." I nodded. "We're also going to talk to the kids about boundaries. Not about what happened, but about trust and respect. They don't need to know the details, but they need to understand that their parents are working through something." "Of course," she said softly. "I'll follow your lead." And I added, my voice sharp, "You're quitting your job. Today. There's no way you're going back to work with Paul or anywhere near him. I don't care if you work again or stay home, but you're done with Harper and Associates." Her face fell slightly, but she nodded. "I'll draft my resignation letter this morning." "Good." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to get started. That day, Angela followed through on her promise. She called her office, informed them she was resigning, and emailed her letter of resignation. She didn't mention Paul, likely fearing backlash or retaliation, but she made it clear she wouldn't be returning. I scheduled an appointment with a marriage counselor I found online, making sure the first session was within the week. Over the next few days, things remained tense but civil between us. We focused on the kids, maintaining as much normalcy as possible. Angela tried to reach out to me several times, but I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to let her in yet. When the day of our first counseling session arrived, Angela and I drove to the therapist's office in near silence. The session was difficult, raw, and emotional. The therapist guided us through our feelings, helping us unpack the layers of betrayal, guilt, and anger. Angela admitted to feeling neglected in recent months, but she took full responsibility for her actions. I expressed my pain and mistrust, acknowledging that rebuilding our marriage would be a long, arduous process. After the session, we sat in the car for a while, neither of us saying much. Finally, Angela turned to me. "Thank you for giving us a chance," she said quietly. I nodded, staring out the windshield. "Don't waste it," I replied. Weeks turned into months. The counseling sessions continued, and slowly, the cracks in our relationship began to heal. Angela threw herself into rebuilding my trust, being open about her thoughts and feelings, and taking steps to address her own insecurities. I, too, worked on letting go of my anger and learning how to communicate better. One day, while repairing the garden shed, I caught Angela watching me from the kitchen window. She gave me a small smile, one filled with hope. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Months passed, and while life regained some semblance of normalcy, the scars of what had happened remained. Counseling became a routine, and though it was often difficult, it felt necessary. Angela was consistent in her efforts. She avoided secrecy entirely, kept me updated on every aspect of her life, and worked hard to rebuild the trust she had shattered. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Angela approached me in the living room. She looked nervous, clutching a small notebook in her hands. "I've been writing," she said quietly, "about everything. My feelings, what I've done, and what I need to do to make this right. I want you to read it when you're ready." I looked at the notebook, hesitant. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to avoid dredging up the pain all over again. But another part of me, the part that was still searching for closure, knew I needed to see her efforts. "I'll read it," I said finally. "Not tonight, but I will." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she gave me a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered, setting the notebook on the coffee table before retreating to the guest room. A week later, I finally opened the notebook. Inside were pages filled with raw honesty. Apologies, reflections, and plans for how she intended to continue rebuilding our marriage. She wrote about her guilt, her shame, and her determination to prove that she was worthy of another chance. It wasn't easy to read, but it showed me that Angela was truly committed to making things right. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen, sipping coffee. I placed the notebook on the table and sat down across from her. "I read it," I said. She looked at me, her expression anxious. "And? It's a start," I admitted. "You've put a lot of thought into this, and I can see how hard you're trying. But words are only part of it, Angela. Actions are what matter now." "I understand," she said, nodding. "I'll keep working on it for as long as it takes." As the months turned into a year, things continued to improve. The kids never learned the truth about that night, and for that I was grateful. Angela and I became more open with each other, and our communication improved significantly. Counseling helped us navigate the difficult moments, and slowly, my anger began to fade. There were setbacks, of course, moments of doubt, arguments that reignited old wounds, and nights where I slept in the guest room to clear my head. But there were also moments of progress. Shared laughter, quiet nights together, and the gradual return of intimacy. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Angela reached for my hand. I hesitated for a moment before letting her take it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up on us." I looked at her, the woman I had loved for so long, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you for fighting for us," I replied. "The journey wasn't over, and it never would be. Marriage is a constant work in progress, and ours was no exception. But for the first time in a long time, I believed we had a chance. And for now, that was enough." The next year brought new challenges but also new opportunities for growth. Angela found work with a nonprofit organization, something far removed from the corporate environment where Paul had preyed on her vulnerabilities. Her new role not only gave her a fresh start, but also filled her with a sense of purpose that I hadn't seen in years. She was thriving, and her confidence grew steadily. For my part, I worked on letting go of the lingering bitterness. It wasn't easy. Trust is fragile, and rebuilding it felt like balancing on a tightrope. But each day, Angela proved her commitment to earning back my trust, and over time, I found myself relaxing into the life we were reconstructing together. One afternoon, about 2 years after that fateful night, Angela came to me with a proposal. "David," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking. Maybe we should renew our vows." I looked up from my laptop, surprised. "Renew our vows?" "Yes," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to recommit myself to you. To us. Officially." The idea caught me off guard. Part of me resisted. Those vows had been broken once, after all. But another part of me, the part that still loved her and saw the effort she had poured into repairing our relationship, recognized the significance of the gesture. "Let me think about it," I said after a long pause. She nodded, not pushing me for an answer. Over the next few weeks, I mulled over the idea. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that renewing our vows wasn't just a chance for Angela to recommit to me. It was an opportunity for both of us to affirm the new foundation we had built together. We were no longer the people who had stood at the altar all those years ago. We were older, scarred, and wiser, but we were still standing. "Let's do it," I told her one evening as we sat on the couch. Her face lit up with a mixture of surprise and joy, and I felt a warmth in my chest I hadn't felt in a long time. The ceremony was small, just us, the kids, and a few close friends and family members. Angela wore a simple white dress, and I donned a suit I hadn't worn in years. As we stood before a justice of the peace in a quiet garden, surrounded by the people who mattered most, I realized how far we had come. When it was my turn to speak, I took Angela's hands in mine and looked into her tear-filled eyes. "Angela," I said, my voice steady, "we've been through more than most couples ever will. We've been tested in ways I never imagined. And yet, here we are. Stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever. I promise to stand by you, to continue growing with you, and to never take for granted the second chance we've been given." Angela's vows were heartfelt and emotional. She promised to cherish me, to honor the trust we had rebuilt, and to never let us lose sight of what truly mattered. As we walked away from the ceremony, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. Our journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was ours and we had fought to reclaim it. That night, as we sat together on the porch, watching the stars, Angela rested her head on my shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" I asked, glancing at her. "For believing in us," she said. "For giving me a chance to make things right." I wrapped my arm around her and pulled her closer. "Thank you for fighting for us," I said. In that moment, I knew we had turned a corner. We had faced the storm, weathered the lightning, and come out stronger on the other side. Over the following months, life settled into a steady rhythm. Our relationship was no longer a fragile, patched-up version of what it once was. Instead, it had evolved into something new, something built on honesty, effort, and resilience. The scars were still there, reminders of the storm we had endured, but they no longer defined us. Angela and I found joy in the small things again: quiet mornings over coffee, evenings spent helping the kids with their school projects, and long walks where we talked about everything and nothing. The laughter returned to our home, cautious at first, then wholehearted as time went on. The kids thrived, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had once threatened to tear us apart. They knew their parents were working harder at being present, and they appreciated the renewed focus on family. For them, life felt normal, and that was all I had ever wanted. One evening, about 3 years after that fateful night, Angela and I sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm, and the cicadas hummed softly in the background. She leaned into me, her hand resting lightly on mine. "David," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never thought we'd get here. There were so many nights when I thought I'd lost you for good." I turned to her, meeting her gaze. "There were nights I thought the same thing," I admitted. "But we fought for this, Angela. Both of us. And I think that's what makes it worth it." She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying, for giving us a chance." I squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for proving it was worth it." That night, as we lay in bed, I reflected on everything we had been through. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak. It had all brought us to this moment. We weren't the same people we had been before, but that was okay. We were stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected than ever before. I glanced over at Angela, who had already drifted off to sleep, her face peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm and contentment wash over me. We had weathered the storm, rebuilt what was broken, and come out on the other side. Not perfect, but whole. And as I closed my eyes, I realized that was all I could ever ask for.